very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name's Claire Chatterton. I'm going to be your chair for this evening, and we're organising this event on behalf of the Royal College of Nursing, a UK membership organisation. But it's great to have people from around the world joining us. The event is part of the Library Museum exhibition series Prison Nursing Unlocked, which has been jointly organised by the Justice and Forensic Forums of the Royal College of Nursing and the History of Nursing Forum, of which I'm a member. And I was one of the volunteers that worked on the exhibition and event series. So it's really great to see this event series now in full flow. This event will be dealing with themes of healthcare in custody and forensics, and this will include references to suicide, domestic violence, abortion, child abuse, sexual assault, and other distressing topics. And if you find any of these topics overwhelming, please feel free to step away and rejoin us when you're ready. So now some housekeeping. I know many of you are very familiar with using Zoom, but just a few things that you need to know for tonight's event. First of all attendees will be on mute throughout the event. And we also ask you to ensure that your video cameras are off also. The only video that will be switched on will be the person speaking. If you're having trouble with Zoom, please do try and leave the event and then click on the link to rejoin. You can also use the chat function to contact Sarah that's just been speaking to you privately so that she can help if possible. Also, we need to let you know that we have been having some problems with the chat function, so that is not going to be available tonight for a general discussion. What we'd like you to do is to use the Q&A function to post questions that we can then post to the speakers at the end. If you're not sure where that is, you should be able to find it at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little circle with 3 dots in it where it says more, and if you click on that, you'll find Q&A if you can't see it on your screen at the moment. So we're going to have 3 speakers, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Louise Jackson, Dr. Gethin Rees and Karen Swinson, who will speak to us in turn, and I'll introduce each of them as they're ready to start their talks. And once they've finished, we'll then have time for Q&A at the end, and the event will finish by 7:25 at the latest. So let's get on with the talks, and thank you again for joining us. So our first speaker is Professor Louise Jackson. She's Professor of Modern Social History at the University of Edinburgh. She is the author or co-author of 5 books, including Women Police, Gender, Welfare and Surveillance in the 20th Century, and more recently, Police and Community in 20th Century Scotland. So I'd now like to hand you over and give a very warm welcome to Louise Jackson. Thank you, Louise.
Many thanks, Claire, and hello, everyone. I think Sarah is going to be showing the slides for me and assisting with that. So she's just bringing them up and then we'll get started. So the aim of my talk today is to look at the prehistory of forensic nursing, that is, the origins of it before it was officially named, if you like. I'm a social historian, as Claire has intimated, whose research has focused specifically on the history of women in police roles, mainly as police officers. But what I want to do today is to use this to reflect on the history of the relationship between policing and nursing. And I'm going to be asking a number of questions. What are the origins of nursing in a police custody context? Who was it who was undertaking the kind of work that we might now associate with forensic nursing? What were they doing and why? And I'm going to be focusing, as you'll see from the title on the screen here, on the 1880s through to the 1920s. I'll be examining the history of police matrons and also the very first policewomen in Great Britain who were in fact trained nurses. One of these, Edith Smith, is pictured at the top of the slide here, but we'll turn to her story and hear more about her in due course. If we could move on to the next slide, I want to say something about the broader context of this period. So the period 1880 to 1920 is a distinctive one in terms of women's entry into professions from which they had been previously excluded, including things like medicine, law, policing, and also into new occupations that were not yet clearly defined, such as social work. Now, midwifery and nursing were clearly traditionally already feminized occupations, But they were also being transformed through professionalisation. And many of you will know that the Royal College of Nurses was founded in 1916. But many of these new and professionalising occupations were interrelated, and the boundaries between them were permeable. And I think that's really important to the conversation today. In this period, there were extensive debates about women's legal and political rights, including, of course, votes for women, and also about their social roles. Women's citizenship, including for many who campaigned for votes for women, was often seen as predicated on their femininity and in terms of social maternalism. It was seen as an extension of their nurturing role into the broader public sphere, especially during the First World War, which is also an important backdrop to what we're going to be looking at. Let's move on to the next slide, and we're going to be looking first at police matrons. So in terms of nursing care in a police custody setting, the appointment of female matrons is, I think, a significant part of the prehistory. Between 1885 and 1895, there was a concerted campaign in Britain to persuade the Home Secretary that full-time matrons must be employed at any police station that had cells to ensure appropriate care for women taken into custody. The key figure in this campaign was Florence Balgani, who's pictured here on the left. She was a prominent member of the National Society for Women's Suffrage, the Women's Liberal Federation, and also the British Women's Temperance Association. She was a very active campaigner across a wide range of causes. Her pamphlet on the right here, A Plea for the Appointment of Police Matrons, was published and circulated in Britain in 1894. And the campaign was also supported at Westminster by radical Liberal MPs Henry Joseph Wilson and Thomas Pickersgill, who raised the matter regularly and routinely, in fact, through parliamentary questions. The campaign has highlighted key cases involving women wrongfully arrested, where it was felt that the presence of a matron on site could have made a very significant difference. The pamphlet on the right-hand side mentions the Miss Cass case, but actually even more importantly was the death in Wolverhampton in 1893 of a Mrs. Brown, who'd been found in the roadside in what was described as a paralysed condition, but had been wrongfully arrested as drunk and disorderly, and who tragically died in custody overnight. And clearly campaigners argued that in that case, having a dedicated police matron with nursing training in the cells to meet her would have prevented that. So they had a very powerful case to make. Let's move on to the next slide, because I want to ask next, why did the campaign emerge when it did? And this was in part because of the example that had been set in the USA. Knowledge of this spread through temperance and suffrage networks. There were strong transatlantic networks between British and US campaigners. And in 1891, Florence Balgani, who we saw in the previous slide, who was an avid writer and campaigner, had spent 12 months in the USA on what was in effect a social study or fact-finding tour. She toured police stations across the states and was impressed very much by the female matrons who had been appointed there, including in New York and Chicago. But the extract that you've got here from the Women's Signal Budget relates to her meeting in Indianapolis with police matron Mrs. Annie Buchanan, who had in fact been born in Newcastle in England in 1845 to Scottish parents and had migrated with them to the US when she was 9. Balgani met her and she accompanied her on her duties, and she wrote the following in the article that you can see here. She said, "I witnessed her firm yet gentle treatment of the drunken, the obdurate, the violent, the timid first offenders, and marvelled too at the medical skills she evinced in dealing with those who are under the influence of drugs or incapacitated by illness." The emphasis in this article is on the skill, but also interestingly on the kindly woman's touch and on the motherly advice, which is, I think, the social maternalism that I mentioned earlier in terms of the framing of this in relation to women's particular attributes and why they should be doing this. Balgani led a deputation to Home Secretary Herbert Asquith in 1895 and had considerable success in drawing attention to the issue in the UK. So let's move on to the next slide. There had been police matrons before, so before the 1880s and the 1990s and before Balgani started campaigning around this, but their presence is really difficult to discern in official reports. So there are very few traces of them. Police forces were inspected annually from the 1850s onwards to determine whether they were efficient by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabularies. And in fact, the first reference to a matron is in 1875, and in fact in Scotland, where it was stated that the wife of the inspector at Dunoon has been appointed as matron of the police cells. By 1883, the wives of police inspectors and sergeants in Oban and Campbelltown, also in Argyllshire, were being paid an allowance for acting as matrons. They may have been doing this before, but it wasn't recognised or accounted for in the HM's reports. The appointment of police matrons in Edinburgh and Glasgow was seen as exemplary by campaigners south of the border, and the practice of appointing matrons, mostly police wives or widows, was generally widespread across Scotland by 1889, although not on a full-time basis. If we can turn to our next slide, we can pick up the story in relation to England, where formal adoption was slightly slower, with the Metropolitan Police employing their first matron in 1883, a second in 1886, and 14 by 1889. And then we find references to matrons in Newcastle and Dewsbury in 1893, if we trace them through the reports. In most smaller towns, there was access to a police matron, but their employment was hugely casualised. They often had no fixed hours, and as this extract shows here, which I'm not going to read out, but as it shows, they were simply to attend when requested. In effect, they were on 0-hour contracts, if you want to use contemporary language to talk about this. Their social status varied hugely from being the chief constable's wife to being what was described as a local charwoman. In most cases, actually, they were police wives or widows, and this continued well into the 20th century. Their duties consisted of dealing with and searching those taken into custody upon arrival, attending to them at meals and in cases of illness. If not on the premises, they were summoned by messengers, telephones, or alarm bells. Whatever their status, they were not sworn in, and they had no pensions, unlike male custody sergeants. In sum, coming back to Florence Balgani, her campaign was successful in ensuring the appointment of salaried matrons as a permanent presence in English cities, including all police stations in London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Salford by the end of the 1890s. Women had been working in these roles before, but their work was often invisible in the official record or was ad hoc with inconsistent practices from place to place. Balgani's campaign ensured recognition and more joined up thinking. Next slide, please. I've not come across any portrait images of the women who worked as matrons in British towns and cities in the 1890s and early 1900s. Neither do we have memoirs or autobiographies, so far as I'm aware. To find them talking about their work in their own words, however, we can turn to the testimony they gave in court in relation to criminal justice cases in which they were involved. And these can be traced through accounts of court trials published in the newspapers and the Old Bailey proceedings. And I'll give just two examples here of cases that attracted considerable press attention at the time. And my interest is not in the defendants themselves here, which is what the interest is usually in, but it's in what these cases tell us about matrons. And the first case that I've got here in this slide is, I'm going to look at the role of police matrons in the Kitty Byron case of 1902. So in 1902, 24-year-old Kitty Byron was accused of the murder of her male partner, a married stockbroker with whom she was cohabiting and who was said to be violent towards her. She admitted fatally stabbing him in the street with a knife. She was arrested and she was taken to nearby Cloak Street police station in the City of London. At the inquest soon after, the two matrons who had looked after Byron while she was in custody provided important information. Matilda Cooper was the matron who had searched Byron when she arrived at the station. She said Byron had asked for her hat slightly later on in the evening, which she brought for her. It seems likely that Byron secretly removed a hat pin that she then concealed beneath the bedclothes in the cell. Ellen Affleck, who took over from Cooper on the night shift, had to intervene to prevent Byron from killing herself with the hat pin. Byron also confessed to Affleck that she had originally intended to commit suicide with the knife, but had been talked out of it by the kind words of her landlady. When the case came to trial at the Old Bailey, Byron was convicted of murder, but was reprieved of the death penalty after a petition signed by thousands of members of the public who saw her as more sinned against than sinning because she was a domestic violence survivor. In this case, police matrons were clearly involved in testifying about Byron's state of mind and watching her to prevent suicide. And this information did not affect the verdict, but it did affect the jury's recommendation to mercy. So let's move on to the next slide, which is the second case I want to talk about. In other cases too, like the Byron case, the testimony of matrons sheds light on their work, enabling us to build up a composite picture of it, watching prisoners and sitting with them constantly, recording evidence of their emotional and psychological states, examining injuries and assisting them with washing and physical care. And the second example here then is one that was widely reported in the press as the Hampstead love tragedy. That's the press and its sensational packaging. The background to the case was that in 1901, Maud Eddington managed to shoot her 24-year-old fiancé, John Bellis, in a Hampstead shop with a revolver. She had intended to shoot herself and the gun had gone off as he tried to intervene. She sustained minor injuries, but he was hospitalized and died shortly afterwards. She was ultimately acquitted of his murder, but convicted of attempted suicide. Annie Broad, the widow and police matron who looked after Eddington at Roslyn Hill Police Station, described how she was called to the police station in the afternoon, and this is the brief extract of quotation you've got on the slide there. When cross-examined, she explained that I took her to wash her hands. Her hands were very black, so the water would have been dirty. She cried a good deal when she was charged. She was hysterical. When I first came to her, she seemed to be putting control on herself, but she then broke down. There was a kind of rash on her forehead. It looked as if the revolver had been discharged at it. As in Byron's case, the police matron who cared for Eddington gave evidence that helped build jury and public sympathy. Next slide, please, because I'm going to put aside the police matron's story. And in this next slide, I want to move on to policewomen. Clearly, as we've seen, the main driver of the campaigns for female matrons was the care of women taken into custody. The impetus then shifted in the Edwardian period to the appointment of women as investigating officers in police forces to take statements from female and child victims of assault, to deal in some cases with aftercare, and to accompany them in court. And I want to focus here on the work of the first two women appointed in this capacity, both of whom were trained nurses and who, in fact, went back into nursing after their brief policing careers. Mrs. Edith Smith, who you see here, was the first woman to be sworn in as a regular police officer employed by a UK police force, in her case, Grantham, Lincolnshire, with full powers of arrest, the same as any male officer. So she's, a clear pioneer here. Born in Birkenhead in 1876 and a mother of four, Smith had been widowed in 1907 and went on to train as a midwife in London at that point, and then to work as a nurse midwife. When the First World War started, she became involved in one of the organisations that was promoting policing roles for women, and in 1915 was sent to Grantham to take up a post there at the request of the Chief Constable. Why Grantham, you might ask? Well, it was related to the presence of armed forces in the military camps surrounding the town. The need for a female officer was framed in relation to concerns about what at the time was called khaki fever, the excitement of young women who flocked to places where troops were garrisoned, excited by the presence of soldiers in uniform. This was causing what was seen as a huge public order problem, as well as a public health problem, given concerns about increasing STD rates in an era in which effective cures were only just emerging. Some of the women were sex workers, others were teenage girls seen as in need of protection. As a result of her work, 40 women were convicted of prostitution-related offences in 1916, and Edith's role was clearly regulatory, which is why she was sworn in. But to move on to our next slide, please. I do also want to emphasise here that her medical knowledge was drawn upon as well, and there were forensic nursing examples or elements to her duties. Why do we know this? Well, it's because at the end of her first year, Mrs. Smith presented a report on her work and what had been achieved. The quotation on the slide is taken from the coverage of the report that she wrote, explaining that all female prisoners and children came under her care in relation to police stations. I want to focus on the last two sentences, which tell us that, quote, in one large case of alleged illegal operation, and this is a reference to abortion, this system was found most useful, the policewoman's reports going directly to the chief constable. Thus, a painful and difficult matter was successfully handled, and the fact of the policewoman being a trained nurse gave the woman confidence, or gave the woman confidence. So, reading between the lines, I think we might assume sympathy, sensitivity, tact, and care for the woman on whom the operation had been attempted. This enabled the building of the forensic evidence through a relationship of trust. So it's interesting, these references to nursing there. Edith Smith was highly unusual. A small number of forces appointed women in various capacities, but she was the only one until much later in the 1920s to have powers of arrest. Next slide, please. So I've emphasized the moral dimension of Edith Smith's work, but it's also important to acknowledge that the early wartime work of the first paid women police officers involved crucial child protection work. Scotland's first paid female police officer, Emily Miller, was appointed by Glasgow City Police in September 1915, although without powers of arrest, and to work in plain clothes rather than uniform. Now, we have no portrait image of Emily Miller, so I can't show you a picture of her here, but we do know that she was born in Govan in 1871 and had been employed previously as a nurse at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, then at Greenock Poorhouse and Asylum, and had trained for 2 years as a psychiatric nurse. Prior to her police appointment, she had also worked with the Glasgow branch of the National Vigilance Association, which carried out social work related to moral welfare and campaigned against prostitution and sexual exploitation. Emily Miller was appointed as an investigation officer attached to CID to take statements from women and children in cases of sexual assault and to support victims when they were required to give testimony in the courtroom. Next slide. We have additional insight on Emily Miller's work because she was interviewed in 1921 by a parliamentary committee chaired by Sir John Baird that was considering whether more women should be appointed to British police forces. She told the committee that any woman appointed as a police officer, and I'm quoting from the lengthy script that you've got here, so any woman appointed, quote, should have some experience of physiology and nursing, perhaps not nursing, but at least a general knowledge of disease. In part, this was because she had to warn mothers what to do if children who were unfortunate victims of sexual assault had signs of STDs. She said, I can tell the mothers that if certain symptoms occur, they should communicate with me and I will arrange for them to go into hospital. Miller also described in her interview the very significant work that was involved in taking statements from children and girls, in gaining their trust, and using language they understood. Last slide, please. So when we look at the history of women as serving police officers across the broad trajectory of time, The focus is often on gradual expansion of numbers and roles across the 20th century, from that story, if you like, of Edith Smith and Emily Miller up until the present. It's really important, I think, to know that when women were first brought into policing, it was to undertake specialist duties with women and child victims of assault. You know, that was the defining point of their entry, as well as working with female and juvenile offenders. They were working in specialist units or police women's departments. Numbers remained very small up until at least the Second World War. It was only in the 1960s that women's roles significantly expanded, as this slide shows here. And from 1975, that, in theory at least, they undertook the same duties as men. But the interesting part of the story here for me is the first part of the 20th century, because at least until the Second World War, there was police work on the one hand, and there was women's police work on the other, which was a very distinctive set of duties. And as I've shown here, it had emerged from the intersection between nursing, social work, and criminal justice, and was sex-specific, extending women's caring duties into the sphere of policing. So to sum up, whilst forensic nursing has only been recognised as a specialism over the last 30 years, I hope I've demonstrated that elements of a prehistory can be traced in the work of late 19th century police matrons and early 20th century women police who worked at the interface of nursing and criminal justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was a really interesting session. I certainly learned a lot. And please do, those of you that are listening, start thinking about questions and post them in the Q&A when you get the chance. So I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, and that's Dr. Gethin Rees. Gethin is a senior lecturer in sociology at Newcastle University. He has over 20 years of experience analysing forensic medicine, including the work of doctors and nurses performing forensic intervention in sexual offence cases, the use of sleep medicine in criminal cases, and the work of healthcare professionals in police custody suites. And from September this year, Dr. Rees will be a Leverhulme Trust Research Fellow, preparing a monograph, bringing together his various projects in order to develop a sociologically informed analysis of forensic medicine in general. So thank you very much, Gethin, and over to you.
Thanks, all. And firstly, a huge thanks to Sarah for inviting me and for the RCN. And just off the back of Louise's fantastic presentation there, I mean, we didn't have much conversation beforehand, but the links and the parallels, particularly the international dimension, the relation of gender, is so important to the themes that I'm going to be picking up on and carrying on. So that was a fantastic first presentation to move on from. So as Claire mentioned there, I'm a sociologist who has been following forensic medical professions around and interviewing them for about 20 years. One of the issues that I've explored in detail is what sociologists often refer to as role substitution, i.e. when one professional group takes over a task or a responsibility from another. In particular, I've explored the greater role of nurses within forensic roles, in particular the sexual offence intervention, but also more recently police custody work. But for this short presentation, I will focus on the forensic nurse examiner role, often shortened to FNE, or known internationally as the sexual assault nurse examiner, SANE. The 1970s and 1980s saw significant critiques in Anglo-American contexts of the forensic intervention following a report of sexual assault. During this period, doctors solely performed the forensic examination and were overwhelmingly male. A rightful onslaught of criticisms were addressed at the forensic practices at the time, both for the horrendous manner in which intimate examinations and evidence collection was performed, often without any choice on the survivor's part about who or the gender of the person who will perform the examination, and also that doctors paid by the police were often, quote unquote, prosecution-minded, i.e. not taking an independent stance, but trying to actively assist the police. Internationally, responses to these criticisms differed, but largely they can be generalized as the production of standardized kits. And some of you might recall, not that long ago, there was a bit of a panic about rape kits being left in warehouses, predominantly in North America. I mean, so these are the kits, the tools, the kits necessary to take evidence in sexual offense cases. Standardized kits that made the examination more structured, the development of specialist centers where survivors could be treated, often open 24 hours a day. And for instance, we can see the first specialist center in Ontario was opened in 1984. And more significant for our discussion today, the introduction of nurses as the professional performing the examination. In North America, and I take this as both US and Canada, the transition to more nurse-led work was reasonably straightforward. Doctors up to that period did not necessarily want to perform post-sexual assault forensic medical interventions, and so were in general glad for nurses to take over that responsibility. As having a larger female workforce, the introduction of SANES led to survivors having greater choice in who performed the examination, while also enabled staffing of dedicated centres for long periods of time, enabling greater coverage and more rapid treatment of survivors. Ultimately, by 1992, a dedicated sexual assault nurse examiner role was commonplace throughout North America, to the extent that the International Association of Forensic Nurses was developed in 1992. The UK story is somewhat different to North America, and again, the parallels with Louise's work here is really telling that the slower development in the UK. And to be very specific by UK, I'm only really referring to England, Wales, and Scotland. While the criticisms of the doctor-oriented examinations were just as significant as they were across the pond, the response was somewhat slower. In 1984, a standardized kit and guideline was generated by the Association of Forensic Physicians, and this was thought to be sufficient to improve practice and reduce the concerns that had been raised. While some specialist sexual assault centres, known as SARCs, were developed in England throughout the 1980s, and the most well-known is probably St Mary's in Manchester, which was opened in 1986. These were not prioritised nationally. It wasn't until a joint Crown Prosecution Service, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary report in 2002, that SARCs were identified nationally as best practice. This CPS HMIC report necessitated local healthcare and criminal justice organisations to develop SARCs in each region or area, and as a result, also necessitated an increase in forensically professional staff. This is where the rise of the forensic nurse examiner develops in England and Wales. But yet again, the story is not straightforward here. While in North America, the doctors somewhat welcomed SANES in taking over roles and responsibilities. In England and Wales, the doctors did want to retain this work, and so were disconcerted when FNEs began doing it. Doctors argued that they were becoming de-skilled as they were not seeing the numbers of cases that they had previously been seeing, although admittedly the loss of earnings from examinations clearly also had an impact. And it's about this time that I became very interested in the FNE role. I applied for a small grant in about 2010 to see how forensic nurse examiners were developing in England, and also had one eye to thinking about the comparison with sexual assault nurse examiners. And so I spent a bit of time in Ontario looking for the similarities and differences between what was going on here to what was happening in North America. During that time, I spoke with 7 forensic nurse examiners in England, which, sounds very small. I totally get that. But again, there were only a small number of practitioners at the time. So I probably pretty much got all the professionals working at that time. And what I want to focus on for the remaining time I have left is one issue that resulted in the FNEs that they reported to me. This issue that probably resulted in them being less successful than they might have been, or as successful as we've seen being in North America. So due to evidence law, while forensic nurse examiners could perform the forensic examinations, they could not necessarily provide opinion evidence in court. Nurses could stand as professional witnesses and give evidence of fact, for instance, the process of performing the forensic intervention, detailing the exact processes they went through during the examination. But it was stated they could not then go on and make an opinion or a diagnosis or a classification or something like that in court. As a result, FNEs had to hand over their clinical findings to a doctor who would then be able to provide an expert report for the court. This division of labor between the nurse doing the assessment, collecting the evidence, producing a report, and handing that over then to a doctor who would then go on to create the opinion evidence for the trial, led to tensions. The tensions were specifically around periods when the nurses used their discretion regarding the relevance of some of the survivors' medical history. For instance, FNEs advised me there was very often a case a survivor would advise them of information that they did not think was relevant to the sexual offence case that was being investigated. So, for instance, you can imagine a termination of pregnancy many years before being disclosed and discussed during the forensic intervention. And we know from legal studies that the use of issues like terminations of pregnancy can be used to embarrass and disrupt and undermine the credibility of survivors in sexual offence trials. So, you know, the nurse, the FNE, you know, has received this information, but is making a decision not to include it as it's not relevant in the case. The report is then handed from the FNE to the doctor. It will later come to pass that the defence in a potential criminal trial might ask the doctor to provide expert testimony about that termination of pregnancy, and the doctor would respond that they knew nothing about it as it was not in the report. And classic nursing, it's not written, it's not done, right? This then resulted in a difficult conversation between the FNE and the doctor, as you can imagine. As a result of this, the FNE program kind of stalled for a number of years. FNEs are still active and practicing across the country, and the United Kingdom Association of Forensic Nurses and Paramedics is keenly attempting to recruit and provide and produce more forensic nurse examiners. I'm also aware of some great forensic nurse examiners working collaboratively with doctors across the country to do their best for the survivors they take care of. But one thing that I think we need to have a rethink around is the legal and professional standing of expert or opinion evidence. Why can't nurses provide opinion evidence? I know of many who would be keen to provide that service to the court, and doing so would remove some of the tensions that presently constrain FNE work. Moreover, in my recent work on healthcare professionals in police custody, I discovered evidence that healthcare providers were giving evidence in trials, but weren't even given the status of a professional witness, because the professional witness status carries a particular kind of reimbursement, an expectation of a reimbursement. And so in these cases, for instance, road traffic accidents, in order to explain the processes that they did in collecting blood, they were being presented as civilian witnesses, the same as, you know, me if I go to present evidence at trial, not in any way being respected for their professional responsibilities, probably because that would result in a fee. I think there is definitely scope for the college to think through what forensic nursing staff should be able to provide in terms of providing evidence, as well as what reimbursement they should rightly receive for performing this vital task. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gethin. That was very interesting. So I'm now going to go to our third speaker, and that's Karen Swinson. Karen is a nurse by background, and her professional nursing career has spanned both the NHS and criminal justice settings. She led the inaugural service of healthcare in police custody being provided by nurses. Working with multiple organisations, she changed legislation and developed national guidance to support subsequent changes in criminal justice healthcare. As a result, she extended the boundaries of custody nursing and created a safer environment for both staff and patients, recognised with a Beacon Award as unique within the UK and still accepted nationally as best practice today. So thank you for joining us, Karen, and we look forward to hearing your experiences. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join. I'm not sure how I managed to go after our two previous speakers. I could have listened to both all night. But let me share my slides with you. I'm hoping that will be a relatively painless process if we go from the beginning here. Okay, I'm going to hope that you can see it and hear me. Okay, so I've been asked to talk to you really about what I guess more autonomous practice looked like across the UK. And in essence, really, that began in 1999. And I guess the catalyst, of course, for that was a national report done in '98 called the Doctor's Bill. And really interesting, Gethin mentioned there, some of the or alluded to the fact that a lot of this work historically in custody suites and of course across sexual assault services were undertaken by what we now know as FMEs, so forensic medical examiners. And back in that time, they were predominantly local GPs who did the work within police custody on an ad hoc basis. So they were called in, came to visit, saw the patient, and then left again. And so in a sort of concise way, really, the Doctor's Bill said this service is just really, really expensive. What we're paying for this, for GP services, is not necessarily affordable going forward. And additionally, it doesn't give the wraparound of care in a more sort of 24/7 approach for detainees. So the Doctor's Bill was published, and a number of people in our government and the Home Office at the time were considering what that might look like. Now, I've been asked to do this as a sort of personal journey really through this. So actually what was happening at that same time, my background was, I was an A&E sister for many years before then. In fact, I did 10 years in A&E, and I saw very firsthand lots of what I then thought was forensic evidence flying across our resus rooms. And so I went and did some studies with the University of Edinburgh around what was forensic evidence really. And I came away with a real hunger and passion for knowing about it. And I indeed, funny enough, wrote to the Metropolitan Police and really interesting, Sarah, I think we need to catch up after this about the journey of the Met, because I wrote to the Met and said, do you think you'll ever put custody nurses in your custody suites? And at that time, they wrote back and said, we're not sure about that just yet, but thank you for writing to us. And then lo and behold, I had a message to contact Kent Police just before October 1999. And it was in fact the Met who had referred me to them as someone who was interested in taking their Home Office pilot forward. And Kent were awarded that first pilot with the ask of trialing what would a custody nurse look like in police custody. So before I move on to sort of what that journey looked like, it's really interesting that Sarah gave us such an incredible history, because I, in my journey since 1999, was often met with, well, where did it start and who started it? And interestingly, I attach a picture there of a letter of the most wonderful gentleman I think I've met along this journey. But he wrote to me in 2006 and was telling me about a number of people involved before then. And actually, he went back to 1987 in Finland. But also, interestingly, in his letter, and we'll come on to it in a minute, he talks about Virginia Lynch. And again, I think, Gethin, I don't think you named it, but you've certainly alluded to the work, Gethin, that Virginia Lynch did across the states in sexual assault work. And it's interesting, I linked with Virginia a little bit after that, but you know, so the fact that, you know, when we come to do something like this, we find ourselves so intrinsically linked that it's just fascinating. And again, you know, some of the evidence that he gave me at that time was very much of a sort of supportive role to the doctor, and dare I say it, almost a handmaiden role was described in some of the evidence that he gave me at that time. But nevertheless, what was our challenge across Kent? Well, back in those days, the legislation, and we'll come on to that in a second, but the legislation in place under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, the sole responsibility of the health and welfare of detainees remained with the custody sergeants. Now, that is a very, very different place to where we are today. But I'm just going to explain to you the journey when it was as it was back then. And so my role was to start a pilot with 7 nurses in Kent, and it would subsequently then grow and roll out. But these are, you know, I do a lot of sports, so some of my terminology in this presentation, I've chosen to go with the sports theme. But this is the first team that were there in Kent, and a fabulous bunch, I've got to say, at that time. Now, the gentleman in the midst of these was really, really important to forensic nursing, custody nursing, call it what we will today, because he was actually the chief constable in place at the time in Kent Police, who drove through, and I quite literally mean drove through, some of the changes at the Home Office to afford nurses to be cited in that in the codes of practice that accompany the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And in fact, when I say drove them through, in actual fact, he quite literally did. At one point, the draft came back to us not quite as was expected, and he literally got myself and him driven to the Home Office to challenge it. So I think as a service we are pretty indebted to that gentleman. However, it wasn't just 7 of us in Kent at that time. There was a full squad of people that I heavily relied upon in this space. I've put up there the Royal College of Nursing. Back then, they were absolutely key. Peter Carter was the chief exec at the time, and Annie Norman was across the prison forum at the time, and both welcomed me into that environment, and indeed were particularly helpful with the approving and the I guess the supporting of some of the clinical guidance that we needed to create in a very new environment that was not necessarily related to the NHS at that point. The MHRA were pivotal with patient group directions, so enabling nurses to administer medications in police custody. all of this was totally groundbreaking at that time, and probably no surprise to any of you who are on the call at the moment, who maybe know of that period, but it came with huge challenge. Gethin mentioned the FMEs in the sexual assault side of the work, feeling de-skilled and in actual fact losing income from that work, and that was no different in the custody setting. So it was a difficult time. I'm not going to say it was an easy journey. It was certainly very difficult. But indeed, all of these organisations played a huge role in enabling the service to continue and to flourish to today, what it is. I note the Inspector of Prisons, of course, what was then the IPCC, which was the old Inspectorate of Police, the Independent Police Complaints Commission was the IPCC, and there was the HM Inspectorate of Constabularies as well as prisons. And at that point, we had the Inspectorate of Constabulary and the Inspectorate of Prisons doing their first ever joint assessment, if you like, of the services that we operated in Kent. So the legislation, we could spend hours on how this came to pass, but in essence, the shift in the code of practice was to afford forensic nurses to be called upon by custody sergeants to provide the care for detainees, indeed not just in police custody, but those who were in custody and subject to detention under the Terrorism Act of 2020. Now, 2000. There have been a number of additional updates to this code, and in fact I think the last one was 2023, but this one was the most significant one in terms of enabling nurses to practice autonomously in that setting. So what came with that? I'm going to rattle through this as quickly as I can. I know we're a little bit behind. But in essence, we had to create clinical guidelines for the management of conditions that would commonly be seen in custody, but not necessarily as they would be treated potentially in an A&E department or another setting. And interestingly, most of the staff at that time came from an A&E background. So it was very much around, well, the condition may be the same, but actually the environment in which we are providing care is very, very different. And so the guidelines were really, really specific to that environment. And indeed, they went through their own journey of scrutiny. But again, very much robust, because we had the right advice and guidance and governance in place at that time. Then came some of the more broader roles around fitness for interview, verification of life extinct, and retrieval of forensic evidence. And again, all of these things were taught by experts in that area. So for example, what was fitness for interview? Well, actually, we really needed to understand, what does an interview under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act look like? What does it feel like for prisoners? What is it? What is the experience that we're trying to then assess people for their ability to go through that process? So these were some really new areas that took quite some time to come around. The middle one there, verification of life extinct, was a partnership with the ambulance service in terms of first responders, but also then needed the additional forensic evidence components to that process. And again, lots and lots of guidance around it, lots of protocols, governance as you would expect at that time. I'm rushing really through this, and I'm sorry because I'm aware we're coming up to 7 o'clock. Patient group directions. I saw a LinkedIn post recently, funny enough, from a pharmacist who said, sometimes we feel like a silent profession. And I was so saddened actually to hear that, because my experience in this world a long time ago was actually with a single pharmacist, and we worked really closely with the MHRA at the time, and in creating the patient group directions to enable nurses to give out those medications in police custody. And they were challenged, believe you me, but they were absolutely key to being able to deliver safe care in the environment in which these nurses were practicing. Training, knowledge, skills and expertise, nothing that you wouldn't expect. With the priorities being to safeguard detainees, reduce death in custody, clinical excellence, early forensic capture and forensic development. And interestingly, I think those still remain the principles of the services today. Now, obviously, as I said, we weren't commissioned in those days by the NHS, and indeed that commissioning came much later, and indeed by that stage when it was commissioned across to the NHS, a lot of police custodies were already then being supported by some of the private sector providers at that time. And indeed that commissioning then took potentially longer because some of those contracts were in place. Some of them were fantastic contracts, and so they continued on. And I think probably today still the vast majority are commissioned in that way through private sector organisations, other than, I believe, Kent and the Met, who still directly employ their custody nurses. I just want to say a little bit to sort of link up with Gethin's talk to us there. And actually, when we started this, particularly in Kent, the sexual assault victims were then taken to what we described back then as safe houses. And they were houses owned by the police, but they were known. Everyone sort of knew in the community what they were and where they were, to have that process. And so, as Gethin said, in 2002, there was a complete rethink around what might that look like in the UK. But actually, we had sort of already started that journey ourselves in Kent, and approached a sexual assault health clinic in one of the local health authorities at that time, and created a partnership really whereby the victims of sexual assault were taken to that particular unit, seen, had their forensic samples taken, and indeed then their follow-up care, as we now know, is commonplace across the SARCs of today. But again, something that, and indeed one of the nurses who worked in Kent Police at the time took an incredible interest in that, and indeed was a real advocate through the UCAFN. I put a picture up there of the IAFN, and again, I think we mentioned Virginia Lynch earlier, or Gethin alluded to the work that Virginia did in the US. And actually, she invited me over to Minneapolis in 2002 to talk about our journey with not just victims of sexual assault, but also those who were arrested for sexual assault. And I say arrested because, of course, in police custody, someone is there pre-charge, and as yet they are, to all intents and purposes, not yet convicted of that particular allegation. Really careful what I say here, but actually there is something around at that time, considering how we dealt with those people in custody, and how that experience had an impact on those individuals, and actually their later life. So there was good in all of it. The forum that we're talking about tonight started off as the Prison Nurses Forum. We were welcomed in, and since way back when, it has been prison and custody, or prison and criminal justice as it was then. It's now nursing and justice and forensic health. So it has evolved, I guess, with all of our journeys here. For me, the good was the people, and yes, it was given a Beacon Award at the time. I was then asked to go and lead the service across the Metropolitan Police, which was quite a challenge politically, I've got to say. This is a book that was written at the time. I think probably a lot of you know who was involved with that, but it's, the good was fantastic. There was the bad. So any of you who listen to the rugby podcast will know there's the good, the bad, and the rugby, but this is the good, the bad, and the profession, really. And so for me, the good was the journey that we started, and the fact that it's still here today and stronger than ever, I think, is probably the way that I see it now. That said, there was incredible challenge, and there was many a time that it tested my resilience and some of those around me to its utmost, and that was because those who were previously doing this role were quite challenging at that time, and I was indeed reported to the NMC. So went through a lengthy investigation with the NMC about what I was doing and what I was leading, and so on and so forth. And so the other thing up there is I was also party to a select committee, which any of you have been involved with. This one was at MOPAC and took place for the Metropolitan Police. And so I was, quite frankly, grilled about that at the time. That said, ultimately, I think it was worth it. It was difficult, but it was worth it. Because the fact that we, and I say we, I mean all of my teams, all of those organisations had worked tirelessly to make sure that we created safe clinical practice within this environment, was testament to the outcome of that select committee. The profession, as I've said, I had to almost count on my fingers earlier, because it is almost 25 years coming up this autumn since we launched this in the UK. But actually, these principles, I think, still remain, and particularly reducing death in custody. If you look at the figures from early 1990s, really, when there was somewhere around 60. And you know, I'm not going to say that there was a point in time when it all flipped, because that would be crazy. But there has been a steady decline over that period of time. And no one's saying it's absolutely because nurses were put in. There was lots and lots of re-education. Custody sergeants have got much more support for healthcare in those settings. There's much more awareness. Mental health has got you know, new boundaries of practice. And so there's a number of reasons as to why the good news is those deaths have really come down to where we are today. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much. I know that was a bit of a whistle stop tour, but it was hopefully an oversight really of how we came to be in autonomous practice in the UK. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was really interesting, and you covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. I'd like to say a very big thank you to Gethin, Louise and Karen for giving up their evening and giving us such an interesting 3 talks that covered so many broad-ranging areas. I found them fascinating. So thank you very much.